Welcome to Fact or Inexact. The name's Angel, and this crime's for you. Daniel was born in 1978 in Alabama. He couldn't wait till he grew up and moved away. Daniel's childhood was a rough and bumpy roller coaster ride of ups and downs. His father was unable to hold down a job due to his alcohol addiction. Daniel's mother worked hard to carry the financial weight. That is, until she suddenly passed away in 1990. It was a stroke that claimed her life. Daniel was only 12 years old at the time of his mother's death. As you can imagine, that tragedy molded who he was. After his mother's passing, Daniel grew up rather quickly, taking on household responsibilities. I'm not talking about light housekeeping. Daniel started doing odd jobs all throughout town to help pay for utilities. Don't forget, Daniel was only 12 years old. His introduction to adulthood was fast and hard, with no breaks and no remorse. Daniel's father was proud of him and welcomed the help. And he made sure to tell him how much he appreciated him every day, because he didn't know how to show him by seeking help for his alcohol addiction. One day, Daniel's father was getting up to take a quick drive to the local beverage shop in town. But when he walked past the kitchen window, he noticed his car was missing. And in its place was Daniel's bike. At the very moment he ran outside, who but Daniel was behind the wheel of his car, creeping down their private dirt road and into the driveway. Daniel's father pulled him from the car by his shirt and through the window. But his father never physically abused him till that day. But he beat him so badly that day that it made up for an entire lifetime of abuse. Daniel was called every insult in the book. He was beaten from the dirt filling the yard, across the front porch, and into the dining room, where he passed out eventually from the blows to his head. His father left him there until after he washed his bloody knuckles and returned to his car to turn off the engine. That's when he saw a brown paper bag and picked it up to discover Daniel had driven the car to town to surprise him with his favorite whiskey. He dropped the bottle and fell to the ground next to the broken glass. I mentioned Daniel's father didn't know how to show him appreciation by seeking help for his addiction. But now, he was ready, because he never drank alcohol again after the incident. It was only 4 months after his mother's death and 2 weeks after his brutal beating when his father decided to take his own life. Daniel found his father swinging from a rope in an old tree behind their house. That old tree faced his mother's gravesite, and she was buried in her family's plot on the property where her older brother, mother, and father all rested. Daniel's father didn't leave a note, letter, or even an indication that he wanted to end things. In 1998, Daniel married his high school sweetheart. She was smart, lovable, and easy on the eyes. And most of all, she showed Daniel grace because, like most of us, he still had some kinks to work out. Daniel had a troubled past, with his teen years not being any different, but his better half sort of evened him out. As he grew older and the more her personality grew on him, he started to change his behavior. By the time he was married, he became the man that he wanted to be. Daniel had moved out away from his home and completely out of state. He was always a hard worker, and people had nothing but all good things to say about him. 10 years later, after a fruitful marriage yielding one amazing daughter, Ruby, Daniel suffered yet another loss. To everyone's surprise, Daniel had lost his wife and mother of his only child. This time, Ruby was the one that found her mother. Daniel's small family was made up of his wife and young daughter, and their modest home reflected as such. They lived in a 3-bedroom home, with the basement being renovated to act as several convertible spaces, one of which was Ruby's sizable recreational space. The rest of the basement consisted of a restroom, wet bar, and common living area. Ruby went down to the basement one day, a day before her birthday, to entertain herself by singing karaoke. Instead, Ruby stumbled upon her mother's body, twitching and swinging from a rope tied around a beam above the wet bar. Ruby's mother didn't leave behind a goodbye kiss or note. Ruby was only 10 years old when her mother passed. A few months prior to his wife's death, Daniel had found that his feet weren't on solid ground. He was terminated without reason, which left him with some figuring to do. Daniel had always been proud of himself and celebrated his accomplishments with lavish gifts. And make no mistake, Daniel wasn't a selfish man. He made large purchases when shopping for his wife and daughter, as he should, right? Why wouldn't he? Because he could afford to do so. Wrong. Daniel was in debt up to his eyeballs. Nothing he had was paid in full except the house. And guess what? He didn't tell his wife anything. Daniel wanted to figure out a plan that didn't include him having to tell his wife a thing. He started immediately looking for other opportunities in tech. He figured since he had many successful years on his resume as a software developer that he wouldn't have a problem picking up work quickly. And he wouldn't have to face the humiliation. His plan went up in smoke when his wife called their dealership. All she wanted was to surprise her husband by ordering the wheels he'd been eyeballing for his birthday. But when she called to place the order, she was told they were in the process of repossessing their vehicle. Daniel may have prolonged his humiliation, but she wasn't spared from it at all. Later that evening, when Daniel returned home, he was pummeled with paper that his wife was tossing at him. The paper turned out to be bills that Daniel failed to pay for months. After finding out about the repossession, Daniel's wife tore his office apart and found the unpaid bills. Her suspicious mind proved her right. The car wasn't the only thing that he left unpaid, but she wanted to know why. She couldn't understand why he would allow them to get behind, or why he would hide it from her. She dug further and found herself in their bank statements. Daniel hadn't received a paycheck in months. He confessed to everything and hoped for the best. Daniel was covering up the worst secret of all. He destroyed his credit by taking out loans that he never paid off, including a loan on his 401k. Instead of saying anything to Daniel, she turned away and she walked downstairs to the basement. Daniel figured she went to have a drink and collect her thoughts. He was right about the drink, but it ended up being her last. In the years following her death, Ruby was still trying to recover. Daniel was working full-time, and Ruby was being seen by a psychiatrist once a week. She was making progress in her healing journey and doing exceptionally well in school. Daniel was still focusing on getting his life back together. He would have been in therapy as well, but he could only afford treatment for one of them at a time. But Daniel sought asylum in the Lord. After he sold their house and moved, he started going to church. And Daniel was able to meet and befriend a great group of people. They knew about all of his troubles and they never blamed him. They were nothing but encouraging. It's a good thing Daniel was able to open up and confide in them so easily because he needed the support. Their lives went on smoothly until Ruby started to change. As most teenagers do, Ruby started to rebel. She was missing curfew, throwing tantrums, and getting into fights outside of school. Daniel tried to talk to her, but that didn't yield positive results. Ruby became increasingly aggressive towards her father, though. 16-year-olds act out, but Daniel was worried about his daughter's mental stability. Daniel thought her therapy was no longer effective. So, to save money, Daniel pulled Ruby out of therapy. Of course, it was against her doctor's advice. But Daniel was putting his energy into seeking the healing powers of religion. And he wanted Ruby to try it for herself. Daniel took Ruby to meet his friends and fellow church members. Ruby was outgoing, but she was new to the church scene and seemed skeptical about whether or not it would work for her. Ruby agreed to attend a service with her father the following Sunday. To their surprise, she had a pleasant experience and returned week after week. One day, Ruby decided to join the youth group meetings. But afterwards, Ruby's attitude went from being back to normal to worse than before she started attending church a month prior. To top things off, Ruby picked up a new habit and Daniel discovered it. A bottle of wine was hidden underneath Ruby's pillow. And Daniel found it when he went to hide a present under there. Can you imagine? He got her a small, dainty cross pendant on a silver chain. He made sure he could afford it, and it was paid in full. Daniel was furious, but mostly hurt because Ruby had been shutting him out once again. When he confronted her, things went exactly as he expected. She slammed the door in his face and locked it. Daniel gave her space to cool off. The next morning, he put a stack of papers on the kitchen counter that he printed out the night before. He was at wit's end and he thought it would be best to send her to a program for kids with specific traumatic behavior problems. Daniel had his mind made up that no matter what Ruby felt about it, he was going to force her into a program, even if she didn't decide on one. He thought he'd make her breakfast in bed before he hit her with such a huge shock. Daniel took a tray of breakfast upstairs to Ruby, only to find her door open and her body swinging from her ceiling fan. Daniel was able to save her life, but he didn't take her to the hospital. In fact, Daniel didn't take her anywhere. He allowed her to recover at home and kept the incident private. Ruby was relieved that she didn't have to go through the trauma of people dumping their concerns on her. But what Ruby didn't know was that her father was up to something. He pulled her from school while she was recovering and gave them notice that she would be out of state with relatives and that she would return to re-enroll the next year. Daniel went out of his way to keep Ruby's attempt a secret. Ruby had been recovering from her injury, but she was becoming noticeably weaker by the day. Until one day, she never woke up for breakfast in bed. Daniel checked for a pulse on her cold body to confirm what he'd already known. Daniel started crying like never before, then called 911. The next day, Daniel decided to clear out Ruby's room in a rage. During the clean out, he found her journal, and out of curiosity, he sat on her bed to read it. What he read was so alarming that he got sick to his stomach. Ruby's psychiatrist had been SAing her, and he even went as far as asking her to run away with him. There's more. The leader of the youth group had also started SAing Ruby, starting with the first time he met her. Ruby's journal also went into detail about the therapy sessions, the force, and the drugs that he had been supplying her with. But there's more. Ruby was pregnant, and she wasn't sure which one of her abusers was the father. And she would never know because she had an illegal abortion the night before her attempt to take her own life. No wonder Ruby tried to end it all. Daniel was bewildered and devastated. He was devastated because Ruby's death was his literal fault. Daniel had been poisoning Ruby since the night of the incident. He was angry with his daughter that she would leave him too, and that she would decide to do it in the same way that her mother carried out her demise. Daniel couldn't believe that she would also leave him with the financial strain after everything they had been through because of money problems. But he didn't kill her out of panic, not out of anger. He was calculated and planned it to look like sudden cardiac death. Daniel wanted to make sure that he could collect an insurance payout this time around. He figured since Ruby wanted to die anyway, why not let her? And why not get something out of it? However, Daniel didn't know that phone calls would start pouring into the police. Ruby recorded a video of the attempt and sent it to both the psychiatrist and her youth group leader. In the video, Ruby talked about what her abusers did to her. But even though the psychiatrist knew that he would be exposing himself, he still had to share it because he suspected that Daniel ended her life. The psychiatrist posted the video to social media anonymously, and it made its way to her friends. Ruby stated in the video that she suspected her father of thinking she wasn't a virgin anymore, and that's why he forced her to go to church. She blamed him for the abuse inflicted on her by the youth group leader. When the authorities arrived at Daniel's home, he was found inside, hanging from the staircase. Thanks for being criminal-minded to the end, and keep coming back again and again and again.